Hello to all of our listeners, and welcome back to The Parent Solution, your one-stop shop for all things educational. I'm your host, Kimberly, and today I have a special guest with me. His name is Tim Kelly. Tim is the founder of Polytope Press, and he's written a sketch of the ideal education system at his website. This specific article is called Optimal Education, and we'll be chatting about it a little bit in the podcast later on. Tim is the author of Natural Healing Self-Empowerment, which is one of the world's most powerful health books. It teaches the way to not only eliminate all diseases, allergies, and even the common cold, but also how to regenerate the human body, like restoring hair color, hair volume, nails, vision, and teeth. All of this is done through innovations in blood building. Tim has done health research for 20 years, and he's learned from some of the best innovators of all time, such as those in nutrition and in detox. Health is mostly about nutrition and detox, which is something that few doctors actually learn about in depth in school. And Tim's work shows that many ideas in nutrition, many current mainstream ideas, are incorrect. Tim has also authored the OptiFlex booklet, which teaches people how to attain optimal fitness at home with no equipment. Tim has exercised for decades using free weights, Smith machines, and Nautilus, but he's also created his own fitness system in order to avoid gym costs and inefficiency. OptiFlex involves intensity, which combines anaerobic and aerobic exercise in order to boost both fast and slow muscles, plus precision muscle targeting. All of this is combined with optimal nutrition. In today's world, where many are losing access to gyms, such systems are more relevant than ever. Tim has also written a history text, The Hidden History of Humanity, which reveals many new insights from Atlantis to the present, as well as designing a three-dimensional periodic table of the elements and writing articles promoting the technology to enable independent homesteads, plus the ideal production system, the template economy. Tim has also written multiple novels. Tim, I am so excited to have you here. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
Of course. I'm super excited to chat with you today. We have quite a few ideas that we wanted to discuss. I know that we were talking about. Why don't we start with the idea of education? What is your opinion on our current education system?
Well, it's been very clear if you go over the history to see how we got into this situation. And some of this evidence may sound shocking to some people, but you just have to go over the history. Charlotte Iserbyt wrote a book called The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America with an insider's view of what was going on inside the educational system. And she showed quite clearly that there is an agenda here, and the agenda is not empowering the children. It's to help turn them into wage slaves in the economy. And if you go back to very early documents, for example, look at the formation of the Education Board in 1902. So you can look that up on Wikipedia. I have a video that goes into the history, and it tells you right there in that board what the mission statement was of the Education Board. And it states in there, they're not interested in turning out individuals. They're not interested in engineers or artists or musicians. They claim we already have an ample supply of people who can think. We just need people to go into their jobs and do them in a more perfect way. And what they mean by a more perfect way is for you not to think and for you to obey whatever they want to do. Now, for many people, this group that formed this educational system is called an elite class. I rename them a leech class because they're basically acting like parasites on the rest of us. They're not interested in our contributions or individual thoughts, and they're just trying to mold us into a system which is grossly ineffective. If their educational system was as powerful as they claim it to be, then why does every aspect of civilization under their care fall apart? And we can see this in every aspect of civilization. We see it in water, sanitation, food, shelter, power, heating, cooling, lighting, telecommunication, transportation. What they do in each instance is move towards centralization. They want a small group of people in charge of every aspect of our lives and the majority to be powerless and inefficient. They also hate nature. I mean, when I say they hate nature, I mean, you cannot even imagine how much they hate nature. their plans are moving towards creating an artificial uterus so that when new lives are formed, they attach the lives to the artificial uterus. Then when the new life is born, they want artificial breast milk. And then they want to raise the kids using a robo nanny. All of these things are very explicitly planned. They just have no interest in individuals having power over their own lives. And we see this now with power and shelter and everything else. The individual is just being herded into this system, but it's not necessary. If you learn how nature works, you go back to what was sometimes called a classical education in the 1800s, kids would learn about the three kingdoms of nature. They would learn about minerals and plants and animals. And when you do that, you're not alienated from nature. You understand that all the complex problems that we face as a society are nothing compared to the problems that nature had to deal with in creating life. And yet nature had infinite, elegant solutions to every problem that was posed to her. So if you learn how nature works, you have an example of how you can solve all of these different problems for yourself. And all the books that I put out help to empower the individual by teaching them how nature works and seeing that they can solve their problems, mainly in relation to those big 10 of civilization that I just mentioned. So that's like sort of a rough overview of how we got into this situation.
Hmm. I like how you said it's not the elite class, it's the leech class. I think that's a very clever play on words. As someone who is an English major, I can certainly appreciate the pun. I
Good.
do agree. I do agree. I think that that's quite an accurate description. Education is not really education in the public schools. It's more like indoctrination. I myself have said many times that school does not make great thinkers, it makes good citizens. So if you want your child to be a great thinker, or if you want your child to be a good citizen, that should affect what sort of education system or what sort of values you hold in terms of the education world for your child, I think.
Yes, I
Um,
agree.
mhm. So on that note, I mean, this is a pretty obvious problem, um, as you say, and I would agree. What are some ways that we can encourage this empowerment in education? We have this problem. How do we sort of work towards a more positive solution?
So obviously we're going to need a curriculum. So
Hmm.
we're going to have to agree collectively as a group of people what we want to be teaching our children. So the four
Hmm.
fundamental subjects are math, language, science, and the humanities. So I have a sketch of how to approach each of those at my website in the optimal education paper. Now, some of these things may seem like they're obvious and straightforward, but maybe not so much. So, I mean, let's start with math. You would think
Hmm.
that math is extremely straightforward, but actually it isn't. There's a bunch of things out there. For example, there's a branch of mathematics called Vedic mathematics. This goes back to ancient times. And it shows another way that you can actually add and multiply numbers. And it's, believe it or not, easier than what we're teaching in our educational system. So right now, the educational system has become so far gone that not only are they not looking for these innovations, but they're reaching a point where they're saying that, you know what, math is too hard. Math is racist. So you shouldn't even be studying it in the first place. So, I mean, if you want your kids to go that direction, then keep them inside the school system. But if you want them to have skills with math, then you can study books like that. There's a book by Arthur Benjamin called Math Magics. It shows a
Hmm.
lot of special math tricks for special math situations where your kids can do a lot more than you might think if you study those methods. There's a whole different form of geometry you can study called synergetic geometry, which is different from Euclidean and is a closer match to how nature does geometry. Switching to language, I would suggest that we need to emphasize root words a lot more. Now, in my case, when I was growing up, I loved dinosaurs. And one of the strange side effects of loving dinosaurs was learning all these root words that went into the formation of their names. So I learned all these Greek roots and all these Latin roots. And later that helped me become a spelling champion in my school because whenever I heard a word, I was breaking it down into its roots. And
Hmm.
if parents get their kids dictionaries that have derivations, because not all dictionaries do, it helps build that curiosity so that when you look up a word, you're seeing where the root words from where that root came. And there are strategies out there. For example, there's a book called Instant Vocabulary by Ida Ehrlich. And in that book, which was proven to massively build vocabulary and reading skills of students as soon as it was applied, you go page by page, and on each page is a root word, what it means, and maybe 10 to 20 examples of how you would create a word using that root. And that's a great strategy for helping build language skills. And then, of
Hmm.
course, you want to have very positive literature when you do that. And then in science, there are fantastic books I reference at my website. There's a paper there called The Challenge of Paradise, and it gets into some of the best science books I've ever heard of. And I learned a lot. And just taking an example, in physics, I learned physics inside the school system, and then I learned physics outside the school system using Paul Hewitt's book, Conceptual Physics. He also wrote another book called Conceptual Physical Science. Now, in the back of each chapter, he would have what I often referred to as kitchen science. And this is something I used in my healing methods. So that, for example, when you go into science, sometimes you'll hear about what the Leach class is doing in the labs. Oh, they have this $1 million piece of equipment. They found this out. You just have to believe what they said. But that's very alienating because not everyone has $1 million equipment in their kitchen or in their garage.
Hmm.
But you do have a kitchen. And if you are taught your concepts correctly, you can go into your kitchen and you can start verifying fundamental aspects of health. You can take, here, let's just use a quick example because examples are always a good thing. Okay, so let's take flowers, for example. So one of my favorite innovators of all time, very obscure, I guess, to a lot of people, is Jean-Henri Fabre. He was a French entomologist, but he loved teaching kids. And so he put together a whole bunch of ideas for teaching kids the basics of life. And one example was when he was teaching the pH of flowers. So in this case, he would take a violet and you would go outside and you would find a violet, and then you would bring it back inside and you could prepare solutions that were either alkaline or acidic. And then you put the flower petal in there and you watch the flower petal change colors. And all of a sudden, hey, wow, now you can go outside, you can find a flower, you can dunk its petal into water, and you can tell whether uh, the water or the solution that you're dealing with is acidic or alkaline. So this
Hmm.
is kitchen science. And there's so many different things. There's a book called Caveman Chemistry by Kevin Dunn, and that's a PDF document that I purchased, and that was having a similar mentality, showing you how to make plastic from stuff that's around your house. Now, most people might not even think that that's possible, but that's the way a proper educational system would work. It would show you how all of these things can be done by you. It would invite you in to nature and not give that speech that the education board gave, which is to say, hey, we already have enough people who can think. You don't need to know how to think like we do, because that's not the appropriate way. One of my other favorite stories I'm just going to mention because it's so relevant to this is about Frank Lloyd Wright, the famous architect. So a few comments on Frank Lloyd Wright. One, when he was a very little kid, he went outside to walk with a relative. And so the two walked for a short stretch of distance in the snow. And when they were done, they looked back. And when they looked back, they saw the footprints that each had made in the snow. The one relative had walked in a straight line. Frank zigzagged all over the place. And when he looked back on that in his later life, he said, this is an indication of the best approach, which is to go and explore everything. It's not about how quickly you go through things, but how much you genuinely understand. Bertrand Russell once said, the greatest reward for a person's toil is not what they get for it, but what they become by it. And I think in the right educational system, we would be coming a lot more. So what happened with Frank Lloyd Wright? Well, first of all, he was involved with some of the first skyscrapers. He learned that under Louis Sullivan, who gave us the first skyscrapers in Chicago. And to do that, you had to work with new materials. And one of those new materials was reinforced concrete. So Frank would get in these clashes with classic architects who went through the traditional education system. And they would say, there's no way that reinforced concrete could hold that much weight. And if you look up, you can find a photograph of Frank smiling on a lawn chair as they load up a reinforced concrete beam. And it's clearly supporting all the weight that he said that it could, when the ivory tower intellectual was completely wrong about how much it could support. So later, this becomes a matter of actually life and death, because Frank was invited to design a hotel in Japan. And he designed this imperial hotel. And when he was designing it, he was asking questions that traditional architects didn't ask, like, what's the native environment like? What are your biggest challenges? And one of the biggest challenges was earthquakes, because earthquakes would topple so many buildings in Japan. So this would cause water shortages, which led to a lot of people dying. So Frank designed a hotel that was designed to act as a major reservoir of water in the event of an earthquake.
Mhm.
Guess what? An earthquake happened. Guess what? People needed a lot of water. Guess what? The Imperial Hotel was the primary place where everyone went to get their water. Now, part of the reason why I'm mentioning Frank Lloyd Wright is because another great genius, R. Buckminster Fuller, who gave us the geodesic dome, which encloses the most space with the least material and is one of the strongest of all architectural forms. These two gentlemen, R. Buckminster Fuller and Frank Lloyd Wright, had a chat about the educational system. Bucky often used to joke that he had been fired from Harvard twice. Both men were apparently banned from the American Institute of Architects, and these are two of the greatest architects in history. So we can see what an optimal education system would do. It would promote education the way that Fuller and Wright talked about it. Fuller actually wrote essays on the ideal educational system. So we would teach science that way, and with the humanities, we would stress geography. I have plans for biographies of merit, so people can hear about some of the more amazing people in history who are maybe not presented to them as often as they could be. And then there would be explicit discussions about what is an optimal civilization? How do you meet all of your animal needs as effectively as possible? Why shouldn't that be part of the educational system? I would actually go so far as to say that there should come a time in the educational system where you should look around the house, ask yourself, what do I want in my house? I mean, actually make a complete list, everything, plates, silverware, furniture, whatever. And then in the course of the educational system, you would learn how to create every last thing. And that'll get us into a discussion of the template economy eventually. But I'll just pause there for you to react.
That was actually exactly what I was thinking. Great minds think alike, right? That's the saying. I think that's a very optimal sketch. Yes, and I like how you called it an optimal sketch of education. I did read through your optimal sketch of education. I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was a very reasonable way of looking at the educational system, because when you think about it, there's so many things. And as a teacher, I will say this: there are so many things that I spend my time, or rather as an alternative educator, but as someone who's licensed to be a teacher, there's so many things that are taught to children in the school system that are frankly completely useless, that I spend my time with my kids explaining, that I spend my time with my kids talking to them about, that I spend my time, and they're like, why are we learning this? Kimberly, why are we learning these things? Like, what is so important about them? And my reaction to that is always, well, you're not necessarily learning it because you need to know it. Take, I don't know, high calculus functions, unless you're going into some sort of career with that involves that sort of high level math. That's not necessary for someone to take. My explanation to my kids is always, well, you're not learning it because you need to know this specific thing. You are learning it because it's going to teach you the skills that are necessary, those skills being discipline, patience, integrity, work ethic. Those are the skills that this is teaching you. You're not doing it because you need to know the material. You're doing it because it's teaching you skills that you can't get anywhere else. Now, that's head knowledge that I'm talking about, and that's more of an ingrained personality, right? Things like discipline and work ethic and focus and perseverance, those sorts of things. What you're chatting about, and what I really wanted to talk to you about as well today, was the idea of your template economy that you've created, because I thought that was fascinating. And I really don't see many flaws with it, but I'm sure that other people may have some objections. We can get into that in a second. But why don't you explain for our listeners here what your idea of a template economy would entail?
Before I do that, I'm just going to flow off your remark on calculus. So there's an author, and again, he's referenced at my website. I think his name is Douglas Downing, and he wrote Trigonometry the Easy Way and Calculus the Easy Way. And I found that that was another way to engage students with math. So one of his little tricks was to create stories involving kind of like a wizard-like character who is
Right.
presented with real life practical problems that he had to solve. And how was he going to solve these real life problems? And it ended up that he needed trigonometry or he needed calculus to solve the problems. So that's one of the ways that you could engage students more, is if you formulate things in that way. I
Mhm.
actually imagined an academic competition that would be kind of like a maze, but maybe not quite, but it would be students that were placed into an arena of obstacles. And they actually had to use their education to get through that arena. So
Mhm.
that's another way to engage students as well. But I'll turn now to your question about the template economy. So with the template economy, you're learning how to construct your life. So I would say that with every economic system that people are familiar with, if you go all the way through history, you could go through slavery or feudalism or capitalism or socialism or communism, doesn't really matter. The template economy is in the background of every single one. So it's always been there. It's just now what I'm doing is bringing it into the forefront and getting rid of the Wizard of Oz people that they put in front of the template economy.
Mhm.
So how does the template economy work? If you're going to have a civilization, it's inevitable as night follows day that you're going to have to start working with tools. I mean, when man first started to become advanced, he worked with tools. So when you form tools, all tools are built from what are called patterns or molds. These are made out of wax, clay, or wood. So let's say you want a hammer. Well, you can create a hammer head out of, let's say, wax. You make an impression in wet sand, kind of like kids playing on the beach. And then after you've made the appropriate impression, you solidify that sand with cement or mortar until it tightens up. And then you pour in molten metal, and out of that comes a hammerhead. So imagine a warehouse, which I call a templatorium, which would have templates for every single tool that you could want. It could be a hammer, screwdriver, drill, brace and bit, auger, whatever. And people go in and they say, okay, I want that. So you look at the templates. You could even have something set up along the lines of Amazon, in the sense that each template creator could list the advantages of their template as opposed to another template. You could have
Mhm.
people reviewing which ones are good, which ones are bad, which ones they like, which ones they dislike. And then once people grab the mold or the template, they make their own, and whatever they make, they own forever. So there is private property in this model. And I would argue that the human body is also private property. So for people who are thinking that it's a good idea that we share everything, no, the human body is private property. You do not share that with other people. So you own whatever you construct in the template economy. So from tools, you go to machines. Machines are built on schematics. These are blueprints for how to assemble the parts of a machine. So then you use your tools. You go into the templatorium, you find a schematic for whatever you want. Could be a DVR or whatever. Some people may think that is just too hard to build. But again, with the right education, things become easier. I could talk about the health aspect of that in a moment, but I'll just keep going with the basics. So after people can build their machines, then they can build buildings. So buildings are built from blueprints, and blueprints are essentially templates of buildings. So people can construct their homes that way. And if there are larger buildings, they can use templates for buildings. But you can see this mentality goes into a lot of different things. Like, for example, let's take clothes. Well, how are clothes made? How is a shirt made? How is a dress made? How is a shoe made? Well, it's actually made from a template or a pattern. There's like crepe paper in the form of a shirt that can be used as a template to make a shirt or make a dress or make shoes. And people would learn those skills. And you just learn the different building materials and how they're made. And then the template economy goes through stages. In its most primitive stage, you would start with things like expendable sand molds to make tools. But once the education increases significantly, we would be poised for a whole new era. And just to give you a taste of what that era would be like, I believe we will reach a point where, if you're familiar with any of the 3D software options that are out there, there's 3D animation, there's AutoCAD, there are things that are out there like that. You create an object in 3D on a computer. I believe that file can then be summoned up not merely on screen, but probably on a 3D holographic mat. So now you see something that you've designed appearing as a three-dimensional hologram. And then you would take plasma, which is sort of a stage of matter that is not quite solid, like electrical vapor almost. And you conform the plasma to the hologram and manifest whatever the tool is that you want. Now imagine if every home had a device to do this. So all you would need is to find out what the latest tools are available, or go into a database, look up the tool or the machine or whatever that you want, summon it up on the holographic mat, use plasma and generate it into reality. And there you go. You could be all set. So I do believe that with this economy, the main thing that you would need are resources, and learn how to work with those resources. And there are far more possibilities there than most people can probably even imagine. So just to give you a taste of that, there's one of the suppressed books I came across, which was utterly fascinating and cries out for more investigation. It's a book called Biological Transmutation. Now, this is going to sound very shocking and probably sound like science fiction, but what this scientist, Louis Kervran, found is that apparently, probably this is microscopic organisms inside life forms are capable of transmuting elements at room temperature. How exactly they do this is a little bit unknown, but Kervran goes through the whole thing. If you read through the paper on confirmation theory at my site, there's a suggestion that underlying all of existence is a form of music. And in my writing, I'm seeing that there is reinforcement for this idea. So with Kervran, for example, he talks about a relationship between oxygen, sulfur, and copper. Well, it's very interesting if you look at the periodic table, because oxygen is like the number 8, sulfur is like the number 16, and copper is like the number 32. So it does appear as if we are looking at octaves, as if music underlies the elements. Again, it's interesting that when the periodic table was first being formulated, there were some pioneers who were thinking that it looked like a musical scale, but then they were all shut up and that information was abandoned. But if we bring that music back, it could be possible that we can transmute elements using a kind of music. And again, if you read the paper at the website, you can see that this might be much more possible than people think. So those would be sketches for heading towards the goal of creating independent homesteads. And that's a very important concept in all of this, because when you talk about what the goal is of an education system, that's important. I mean, what is the goal that we're striving for with the educational system? For many parents, they're going to say, well, I just want my kids to have a good job or a high paying job. Well, even as soon as you say that, though, that you have to pause a little bit, because a classical education might not lead to the highest paying jobs. There's a celebrity out there who talks about, welders and pipe fitters. These people don't go through a classical education. They get extremely high paying jobs. So you have to ask yourself, again, what the goal is. But for me, the goal is not just to conform to the system, to conform to what corporations want. It's for you to be completely independent in your own homestead. I think the proper education system would make you tingle. It would make you excited learning about how nature works and how you can be freer for the rest of your life to do whatever you love to do. And we have to introduce this aspect of this thing too, because you were talking about integrity. There is a morality aspect to all of this, because the more dependent you are on other people, the less chance you're going to be a moral person, because you get stuck in these situations where you feel you have to survive. And what the Leach class noticed was they could often finance morality. I mean, the worst example of this was during Stalin in the death camps. So what happened during that time period were that the professors weren't being paid anywhere near as much as the cruel camp leaders who were beating the crap out of the people of Russia. And so they were able to get millions slaughtered because they created extremely high paying jobs that paid better than being traditionally educated. Unfortunately, I can tell you this is not something in the distant past, because there are job opportunities that I've seen in the past 2 years for FEMA camp administrators that pay better than more professors. So this is where your morality can go straight down the drain. If you don't promote independence in the educational system, you could be looking at the downfall of your whole society.
I really do think that you have a very valid point, with particularly when you talked about financing morality. I find that a lot of people will willingly give up their morality if they feel that they are forced to, because they do not have a choice financially, and that's really unfortunate. And then myself, like, always being focused on solutions, I've done a lot of thinking over these past couple of years as to why that is, right? Why is it that people will willingly sacrifice their morality for some sort of idea of safety, but also because they do not have a choice financially? Well, we have a lot of people that unfortunately live paycheck to paycheck and are, as you said earlier, dependent on the system.
And that's what the purpose of creating the independent homesteads is. So if you have the ability to grow your own food, provide your own water, take care of your own sanitation, you know how to reconstruct your shelter in the event that there's any kind of trouble, you know how to
Mhm.
go out and regenerate power from using a whole bunch of different ways that nature has taught you to do. Let's say that you go out into the workplace and you're in a work environment and your boss is suggesting that you do something immoral. Well, at that point, you can just shrug and say, hey, you know what? I can get my own water, my own food, my own shelter. I have no bills of any kind. I don't really need to be here. See you later.
Mhm.
And then you can just walk out the door. So, in
Mhm.
that sense, this type of approach encourages people to do the things that they love to do so that they are independent. And we get to see the gifts of each individual, because that is my belief that
Mhm.
each individual does have some gift to offer. I mean, you can look at someone and you can think, okay, well, not maybe not that person. I don't think they have a gift, but you always surprised. I mean, if you can just open yourself up to what another individual has to offer, sooner or later they will stun you by knowing something that you had no idea that they would know, and be
Yes.
capable of doing something you had no idea that they were capable of doing. So the
Mhm.
more diversity of stimuli that we give to the kids, the more their brains develop. I was actually just reading a fascinating biography. And one of the things that struck me in that biography was here was a great genius whose right brain was really well developed and his left brain was poorly developed. And it was just a disaster, for decades. And I just kept thinking to myself, wow, if you could just balance education between those brain hemispheres, the gifts that might be coming out to the world, but you need the right educational system to do that, because those formative years are called the formative years for a reason. Your
Very
brain
much so.
develops its patterns. And so it's so important to provide those stimuli that are developing the whole individual early on in the educational system.
Mhm. I will say that like there are many students that I teach, and from bringing an alternative perspective to my kids, a lot of them don't know about different sort of homestead technologies, or even that homesteads are a thing. For me and for us, living on an independent, self-sufficient homestead, we do our very best to make sure that we are living in tune with nature, and that we are making sure that we are providing for our needs and not taking more than we need, and making sure that we are in tune with Mother Nature, and that we're using things that are available to us rather than this needless sort of consumerism. A lot of kids, and not necessarily the ones that I teach, because they know better at this point, right? But a lot of kids don't even know that sort of lifestyle exists. My kids think it's so cool. They're like, "Oh, you live on a farm, like on a farm. You have a homestead. You have your own animals. Like, wait, you butcher your own chickens? Wait, what do you mean milk comes from a goat?" Right? Like, just eggs come from chickens. Like, you just go out to the backyard and you just pick your own eggs. Like, people don't know this stuff, right? And I don't blame the children for not knowing. It's because they're not set up in life, either with their parents or in the education system that we currently have, or a mix of both. They're just not set up for that sort of knowledge. And it's really unfortunate because, as you say, it disconnects us from each other and from our food sources, and from the things that we are using. Now, this template economy that you're referencing, that you're suggesting, I think is an amazing idea. I did have a question for you though. How would someone go about with the template economy if they physically can't make something? How would you go about getting it. Let's say someone is like, it's not within their physical capabilities. Maybe they have a physical disability, or they're just like really small, or they have really big fingers and they can't. So how would you go about that sort of thing if someone's not able to do something for themselves in that case?
Okay, so there's several layers to that
Mm-hmm.
answer. So first of all, I wrote a book called Natural Healing Self-Empowerment. So I'm not going to be
Mm-hmm.
super enthusiastic about suggesting that people can't heal. I think that people can heal. So I would like to see everyone as healthy as possible. And believe me, there are more possibilities there than most people would think. Just a quick story. So there at one point was an individual who suffered a stroke, and strokes can be pretty devastating. And then he suffered a second stroke. And then the word in the medical community is it's kind of like 3 strokes and you're out, because generally a
Mm-hmm.
third stroke is something that you never recover from. But this individual got in harmony with nature using some ideas that are presented in my book from the research of another individual. But once they did that, the paralysis reversed itself and they regained the full use of their lims. So
Wow, that's
there
amazing.
are many, yes, there are many possibilities for getting ourselves on track. But
Mm-hmm.
to go back to your question from another angle, so the way I was imagining this class would work, where every student would at some point go home and write down all the items in their home with a view towards building them, is once the lists were completed, you then had the option with conferring with your classmates. And you could say to yourself, you know what, I don't necessarily know if I want to make clothes. That might not be my favorite thing. And then another student could say, well, I'm not so sure I want to make a hammer or a drill. And then students could trade. They could say, okay, well, how about this? I'll make a shirt for you if you make a drill for me. And so you were talking before about socialization in school. Well, wouldn't that be a great way for kids to socialize? You know, they start finding out who's good at what, who likes to do what, and then who can trade this skill for another skill. So that would be a fantastic way for the template economy to work. And it helps you appreciate the individuals in your community by learning who can do what, who likes to do what, and who's skilled at what. So that would be
Mm-hmm.
a primary solution right there.
I love it. I think that's fantastic. In terms of being able to work together. So the template economy, ideally, you would want to do it within a community so that everyone can kind of help each other, and it's more of a privatized sense of community, rather than what we have as the current model of society. Is that correct?
It is. And I spoke earlier in the podcast about derivations. Do you know the derivation of the word economy?
Mm, I feel like I should, but I'm going to be honest and say that I don't.
It means managing your house. So what does that tell us? At the root of every economy is the ability for someone to manage their house.
Manage
And
their
if you can
house.
manage the house, then together as a community, you can manage the community. But it starts with the homestead, and then it would feed into the templatorium. And
Mm-hmm.
these models for cities, I mean, they have a lot of different precedents, but one of the simplest books just to get your mind wrapped around the basics of a city is a book called City by David Macaulay. And he shows you how cities were formed in ancient Rome. They were some of the best city builders of all time. So they would go out into an area, they would find land that was had suitable drainage and good minerals and good resources, and they would build a military tent camp, and they would outline, do surveying, mark the city streets, have a primary city center where the main city buildings were. And I would
Mm-hmm.
argue that you would set up, and there's what I sometimes call an omni mill, or you could have smaller mills. So they would be like old mills, but they would be much smaller, and they would be designed more for the individual than for a corporation. So it's just for the community to be able to meet its needs. So students in the course of the year could go in there and do runs of, let's say, fabric for cloth, or they could do runs of paper for all their books or whatever. And then during the off season, the public in general would have access to those same facilities for their own private uses. It'd be like scheduling studio time in a music recording studio. So people could just go and do their thing for a little while and then go back out. And this would all be free to the community because it would be understood that every individual would want things to make their life better. So that would be another example of how another aspect of this would work.
Right. I see that as a very good solution. It almost seems as though, and I don't want to say that it's a communal means of, like, this template economy as a communal means of creating things, but that's what it seems like almost, is that we have this sort of template that's the community's sort of property, and then from there everyone gets to either participate or not participate. I can see a problem with our current society being that people would rather just pay money to someone else to do it. How would we kind of get around that, of people who um, don't want to necessarily participate in this economy? Because I think the idea is to have everybody sort of on the same page. No.
Right. Okay. So there are several aspects to that answer as well. I probably won't have
Hmm.
time to go over every one of them, but I'll try to go over some of the most fundamental things. So in the book that I wrote, Hidden History of Humanity, it actually traces the history of finance. And so one of the first things that will urge you into the template economy is learning the true history of money, because it is frightening. I mean, seriously, if you get into this stuff, you will not believe what the actual history of money is. It ties into things like necromance and black magic and a lot of other things that began in Sumeria. So once you understand the true origins of money, you're not going to want to have anything to do with it ever again. Um, so you'll be eager at that point to move away from money. And again, we always have to focus on those basics. Like,
Hmm.
one of the things I hear so often from parents is, but I got to feed my kids. And I keep thinking, okay, so you never heard of a garden, or you never heard of a tree that grows fruit? I mean, there are things
Yeah.
that you can do um, that don't require that much money. And in a template economy, people will still be individuals. As a matter of fact, that's sort of the basis of it. When Thoreau, who wrote his fantastic essays on civil disobedience and life without principle, said he was striving for a world where the individual was at the core of the society. And for me, that's what the template economy is designed to do. It places
Hmm.
the individual. It's actually not, from my perspective, it's not as much about the community as it is about the individual. Because
Hmm.
in a template economy, you can still have one individual that has a great deal of wealth and someone else who doesn't. And the reason why would be because one individual wants to work really hard and
Hmm.
another one wants to barely get by because they're not really interested in working that hard. So it's going to be up to you. But I mean, look at that aspect of society. Let's just take, for example, the fringes of society, like the homeless. So sometimes in those situations, we see these so-called charitable institutions that are set up with, stale bread and canned goods and stuff like that. What if you had free fruit trees growing in public parks? So suddenly now anyone who's homeless could just go and get an apple or get a banana or get some peanuts. Um, wouldn't that make much more sense? That the basics would always be there. And the other
Hmm.
part of it too, I think that needs to be mentioned in all of this is when you talk about people not wanting to do things, well, maybe analyze that just a tad. Why is it that someone would not want to do something? Could it be because an educational system has so stifled their imagination and their sense of what kind of fun they could have is that they don't want to participate in society? But imagine if your classes were exciting. Imagine students that were like truly upset if they missed a day of school because they knew that something probably really exciting happened that they missed.
Hmm.
If you have that kind of fired up understanding of how nature works and what you can do, you're actually eager to do things. Um, I know it's a strange aspect of communism, but they did talk a little bit about there about doing things that you love to do. I know that Thoreau talked about that as the fundamental idea, and for me, that is the goal. Um,
Hmm.
he was asked about this in relation to surveying because he did land surveying, and one of the things that he said about that was he had to ask his clients how they wanted him to survey their land, because there was a way that was more accurate and there was a way that was less accurate. And a lot of times people liked the less accurate way because they could make more money off of it. And eventually Thoreau said, don't hire him who does his work for love of money, but do it for who loves doing the work. And this is another core of the template economy. Why do I say that? Because in the template economy, you're building for yourself. So now Once you think that you're building for yourself, you're led to this question. If you were building exclusively for yourself, how often would you try to cheat yourself?
You wouldn't. You wouldn't.
Exactly. There's a book out there that talks about ripoffs in multiple industries. So what you see is largely each industry is ripping off every other industry. So you'll have, let's say, medicine, where people are overcharging stuff and they'll say, yeah, but I have to get food. And then in the food industry, they'll be, let's say, abusing pigs. This is a strange topic that came up recently with a friend of mine. I was going over some health information and they were talking about how a pig ages. So I was asking him some questions after I read through the material. And what I learned was that if you feed a pig really, really healthy food, it will age slowly and it'll be very healthy all the way through that lifespan. But for a lot of people who are in a non-template economy, they don't care. So they want the pig to age as rapidly as possible. So I asked a friend of mine, so how old are these pigs when you slaughter them? And he said, about a year or two. And I asked him, how long do you think the lifespan of a pig is? And then he was kind of puzzled by the question. And then he said, I think it's a year or two. And I said, no, it's actually a lot longer than that. Pigs are supposed to live for about 20 years. So what happens when you raise the pig super fast, bringing it to what's called slaughter weight, you have a super unhealthy pig. Now you've just made a lot of money in a non-template economy, but you've just put a pig on the market and had people eating its food and they were going to become unhealthy because the pig was unhealthy at the time it was slaughtered. So the food guy is ripping somebody off. And then the auto mechanic is going to rip people off and say, well, people don't know what I'm really charging for anyway. So I'm just going to tack on these extra things to the bill. And then the insurance company rips people off and they don't have any qualms about doing that because they have to buy other things. And then the utility company will rip people off because the work of Tesla showed that you could have had free energy distributed to the whole world. And then pretty soon, if you go through this book, again, that describes ripoffs in just about every field, every single field suddenly is temptingly drawn into ripoffs. You have soft drinks that are being sold that at a price of, let's say, $1 or $2, and the actual production cost is like 2-3 cents. So we're talking about profit margins that go well beyond 100%, to 500%, to 1,000%, to 2,000%. How much of this are we really going to stand? If in a template economy, you'd never see that because everything would be set up to be natural, that there would be no way to inflate the costs. And then there are even bigger horror stories in the background during the 80s that concern how once you've created a money-based economy, especially a fiat money-based economy, the opportunities for fraud are out of control. You have the stock market, which is a showcase of almost every imaginable form of fraud. Insurance, same thing. Real estate, same thing. And then you would have these crooks who would use money running through all three branches I just named at the same time with the same money. So it gets completely out of control until all the money is held in the hands of a few people and the majority of people are suffering. So you don't want to set up any type of economy where there's not going to be love in the work being done. And I know it sounds strange, but honestly, if you understand how nature works, you could actually feel love of plumbing or love of electricity, because you would understand like how the wires are set up. You would understand the difference in the thicknesses of the wire and their conductivity. And you would look at everything you were doing as a form of art. Same thing with a plumbing pipe. I thought of different ways of setting up a house where, since most of the water goes into two primary areas, which are sinks for the kitchen and the bathroom and water going into the shower, if you have those rooms close to the main water supply, you cut down on the plumbing for the entire house. And that's a lot less toxin going into the body just from that alone. So again, I think it's just about inspiring people with intelligent design that fires them up, and then they will want to participate a lot more. And if you truly don't want to participate, there shouldn't be anyone forcing you to do anything anyway.
I myself find it very hard to believe, especially now living the life that we live, uh, that I wouldn't ever want to live this life of being close to our own food. You mentioned, parents are afraid that, oh, well, I have to go to work because I have to feed my kids. And you said, well, what happened to gardening? Like, what happened to like all those other things, right? We've moved, you're right, we've moved very much from an agrarian society, where everyone used to be on their own farms and everyone used to have their own homesteads. Everyone would have, milk got delivered every day from like the local dairy farm or whatever it was, right? And then we perhaps would supply vegetables or some sort of produce. That barter-based economy has disappeared, and we now are in, as you say, a fiat-based economy, and that's not something that is good, I don't think, for people at large, because you have people in this needless consumerism and in this rat race instead of being responsible for their own food. You talked about the pigs, and about how people, this one gentleman thought that they only lived a year or 2 years or whatnot. So we have actually done some learning about chickens. We've been raising our own meat birds since we've been here, which is about a year and a half now that we've been homesteading independently. And last year, when we did our chickens, we discovered we did Cornish cross meat birds. So we bought them from a smaller farm that produced them, naturally and whatnot. Didn't vaccinate them, nothing like that. We got them from this farm, and because of the breed that they are, because they've been bred so much over the course of the last 100 years or whatever, they're physically almost incapable of carrying their own weight because they're just bred to eat. They are literally just bred to eat. Meat birds are different than egg laying birds. I'm sure you know this, but meat birds are different than egg laying birds, for the most part, because meat birds are bigger, they're bred for their meat, etc. So last year we found out that they didn't really live past 8 weeks, and by 8 weeks, like only 2 months, a lot of them could not stand. So what we did this year has actually greatly improved. We got 17 birds this year, and we have all 17 of them still, and they will be 3 months on Thursday. And the reason that we did that is the reason that has happened thus far is because we have limited their food. We have not let them free range with all of the food that they have commercially. We kick them out of their little shop during the day. So they're out during the day, they're roaming around, they're free ranging, they're eating whatever they want to. And then at night, they have their food for 12 hours. So it's like a 12 on, 12 off schedule. And like I said, they're going to be 3 months on Thursday. All of them are all moving around. They're all healthy. They all look much better than they did last year. So just little things that we've learned as well. But we had to put ourselves in that uncomfortable position of trying to learn that and saying, okay, how do we better this situation? Because we were happy with the results last year, but we weren't content. We said we can do better. We didn't like the idea of these 8-week-old birds just kind of sitting around doing nothing. So we said, okay, let's see how we can change this. And so we did. And now we have 3-month-old birds that are all still like moving around very well. Some of them are chasing our layer chickens because they have that much energy. So it's really nice to see. But like I said, we had to put ourselves in the uncomfortable position of being like, okay, well, how do we grow from this? How do we get better? And that's uncomfortable for a lot of people. I don't think that people really want to learn about that sort of thing and want to learn about that sort of lifestyle, because to them, like you said, it doesn't matter. People don't necessarily care about being close to their food sources, which I think is really unfortunate. I think that's really unfortunate.
Yeah, I would say too, in relation to morality, that this is one of the most important things for kids to learn in the educational system. It's a
Mhm.
generalization that you've probably heard many times, but it shows up as a manifest reality when it comes to growing plants for food or treating animals with food. And that is, the way that you treat nature is the way that nature is going to treat you. So if you
Mhm.
raise the plants correctly, for example, by fertilizing them with rock dust, and I hope that you do explore that at some point,
Of course.
you'll see that the plants are extremely healthy and they yield extremely healthy fruit and vegetables. And then because you've taken the time to fertilize the plants correctly, you get all the health benefits back to you. Similarly with the animals, if you look at the animals as, just servants for you, then you slaughter these animals when they're unhealthy, and then you become unhealthy because you're
Mhm.
consuming the flesh of an unhealthy animal.
Of an unhealthy
And
animal. That's right.
and you know, to carry this back to the subject of the leech class, I will just let you know that their mentality towards humanity is very similar to the outlook of many people in humanity towards domesticated animals.
Hmm.
So if you see a bunch of human beings who are thinking, well, you know what? I don't care if that chicken can't get up. It's just there to be my food anyway. Who cares if it enjoys its life? It's just my food. Well, guess what? That leech class looks at you the exact same way. You are just there to be their servants. You're there to fight their wars, to be slaughtered whenever they deem fit, to take whatever injections to make whatever money they can make off of you.
Hmm.
So you don't want to put yourself into that groove. I mean, morally, you want to treat nature as best you possibly can, then you get the benefits from it. So there is an incentive to do that. So it may
Hmm.
seem like it's a lot of extra work to treat animals and plants well, but to use the classic line, as ye sow, so shall ye reap.
Yes, yes, I do agree. I have noticed, and even, since we have moved out here and started living this sort of lifestyle, I have noticed I myself am a healthier person. I suffer from very bad asthma, or I should say, I used to suffer from very bad asthma. I do still have an inhaler for emergencies, but for the most part, I am now able to either A, regulate my breathing on my own accord through like meditation or some sort of breathing exercises. And I'm also able to use nature. Mullein tea and mullein plants are everywhere because we're in the middle of nowhere. Mullein plants are everywhere. And mullein tea, the leaf of the mullein, is very good for asthma. And that's something we found through doing research. So that's something I'm trying to incorporate into my life on a more regular basis too. But just that idea of replenishing nature and helping nature and working with nature rather than working against it. And I think that's a really big part, it seems, of the template economy, like you're suggesting.
Yes. And since you mentioned asthma, I would be remiss if I were not to mention that the saltwater flush is of great help. So please look into the saltwater
I
flush. You
I
created.
have heard about that. I will definitely look into it. Thank you for the reminder.
I had people who had asthma problems, and
Hmm.
they got better as soon as they did that. Yeah,
Hmm.
but see, the other part of the template economy is it fills your imagination, because
Hmm.
as you learn how nature works and how to create all of these different tools, all of these concepts go into your head, you know, basic trade-offs of force and distance, like David Macaulay describes in the New Way Things Work. Once you have your imagination so filled with all these different strategies, that makes you a more capable person, because whenever a new problem comes along in life, you can draw on this inventory of all the problems that you've solved, all the things that you've built. And I sometimes think about this in terms of relationships and gender roles. Speaking as a male who's gone through this society, one of the things that, kind of makes me itchy in a figurative sense is whenever I'm put into a situation where I feel like I can't provide. And then I would think to myself, well, why can't I provide? And it's because I wasn't given the skill set. So then I get driven so much more to learn extra skills that will help me be independent and be able to provide. And
Hmm.
that, I think, is something that, gets at the root of the human experience. I think for women, not for necessarily for all women, but I think for a lot of women, they care about the idea of being mothers and being having children, because they consider that part of the fulfillment of the human experience, being a woman. And for men, a lot of times they like the idea of being providers, of
Hmm.
doing construction type work or working with machines and stuff like that. So it makes them feel like they're offering a contribution, something that excites the people around them and that they're contributing to the community in some way. And
Hmm.
I think these are things that help us feel better about ourselves. And that's important because in the background are things like crime. We see societies breaking down due to different forms of crime. I think with the right education that is fulfilling individuals, I think it all starts with food. But if you get the right food into everybody, and you teach them the way that nature works, you'll see a massive drop in crime. Uh, Weston Price wrote the book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. And one of the things that was sort of a neglected aspect of his work was he showed how poor nutrition played heavily into crime. And then I followed that up with the Appleton, Wisconsin school study. Now, it seems like that's been scrubbed off the internet somehow. It's very bizarre. Now, when I try to look up some of my links, they're dead. And the only thing I'm finding is this study on rats, which is not the actual correct study. But what happened in Appleton, Wisconsin, was that there were a bunch of students who were all showing very negative behavior. There was high suicide, there was violence, there was drug use, teen pregnancy, everything that you can think of in a modern society. So understanding the importance of food, they went in and they changed the environment completely. They got rid of all the junk food, they got rid of all the soft drinks, and they actually changed the lights. That's kind of important because you need full spectrum lights to be a fully functioning human being. All of the negative behavior vanished, all of it, just from changing the environment in which these students were learning. Why is no school system focused on that? And the work went beyond that into a UK prison study where they were trying to track recidivism, or the rate at which people go back to a life of crime after they get out. And they did an experiment, and they put healthy food in one wing of the prison and the normal food in the other. And recidivism dropped 26% in the wing where people were eating the natural foods. So we have opportunities there to get rid of crime in society too. And the other thought that went through my head, maybe you can answer this question, because I asked this question to a teacher friend of mine and she really had no answer. I talked about optimal education. Okay, so optimal is basically a synonym for the best. Okay, so if we're interested in the best educational system, if I were to ask you as a teacher, which school in the United States is the best? I mean, you can pick any category. Which school best teaches language, best teaches math, best teaches science, best teaches the humanities, which has, I don't know, the highest employment rate. We should know this if we genuinely care about education. So, I mean, what goal are we striving for if we can't even identify which schools are the best, and then try to
Mhm.
emulate whatever it is about them that makes them the best? So as a teacher, do you have any awareness when you were in the system of people trying to focus on who was the best and why were they the best?
In terms of schools, you're asking?
What I know, for a little while you were inside the school system. Were
Mhm.
they trying to show you who was the best and how to
Oh,
emulate them?
not necessarily in terms of like names. I mean, there's always the big ones, right? Like Harvard, MIT, like there's always the huge schools that get so much funding and that are always, where the super smart people go, et cetera, et cetera. I wouldn't say that there was more of that it was pushing the idea of, you have to go to this school, or you have to go to, or this one's the best, or that one's the best, or whatever. But it's more the idea of pushing the expectation that you will go, right? Even if you don't necessarily know what it is that you're doing, right? For myself, I was very clear on what I wanted to do from a very young child. And so I was very clear in my direction of education through the post-secondary system. And then March of 2020 hit, and I went, never mind, I'm not going to be a teacher in a public school because it was just not the right time frame at all to be in that environment. But in terms of pushing like a specific like names or dropping specific names, I can't say that I had any personal experiences with that, but it was always the expectation that like you will do these things, especially when I was in teachers college. You will do these, like teachers college taught me absolutely nothing. I think I had one class, maybe two actually, that were both taught by the same professor. Maybe like another one about Russian history that actually taught me something about Russian history, only because the gentleman was actually from Russia when Russia was the USSR. So he had a very unique and original perspective on things. But I digress. My point here is that the post-secondary educations that people go through don't actually teach you anything other than to conform to the system. In terms of imparting actual knowledge that is useful, teachers college did not teach me how to teach. Teachers college taught me about the different rules and the different regulations and the different administrations and all these sorts of expectations and all the different things that I should not do, or I was going to get a slap on the wrist, like those sorts of things. It didn't actually teach me how to be a teacher. It didn't actually teach me how to do what I wanted to do. That came from my placement, when I went into my placement into teachers, and I actually got to work with teachers who are in the public school. And I was very fortunate. I had some great teacher like role models who are fantastic. Like I have no complaints about my teachers college experiences in my placement, because the teachers themselves are actually doing the work, right? And like I said, I was really fortunate. I realized that not every teacher is the greatest, and not every teacher is going to be the worst either. So it just depends on who you get as an individual. But as you say, that depends very much on the individual themselves, and if they want to be there, if they're excited for what they do, right? If they're passionate about what they're doing, then that love for what they do as a job, as a career, whatever you want to call it, is going to leak down into other people.
When I look at the past 2 years, and
Hmm.
I was curious myself how the best academic institutions in the United States would respond to a crisis. I would say that everyone was a miserable failure. I mean, I don't know any college or university in this entire country that had a kind of response that I could admire. I mean, basically, everyone was just saying, yield, get yourself injected, enrich these corporations. And if anything, I mean, especially in relation to Harvard, who you mentioned, the role of Harvard in this is very much a black eye for them. I mean, because they were basically involved in the creation of this mess. So that seems to be a situation where an academic institution was bought off. And unfortunately, it is something that people have to be aware of. I came across this from multiple angles in my health research, but Cynthia Crossan has written a book called Tainted Truth. And
Hmm.
in that book, she goes into how studies are funded, how research is conducted in the academic community. And I have some pretty harsh statements from a couple of people out there. Earlier I mentioned the Education Board of 1902. In 1915, the J.P. Morgan interests got together and they found that they could control the adult mind through the media. And to do this, they only needed to control 25 newspapers in the United States of America, and they can control public opinion. So
Hmm.
by controlling the educational system, they had control of youth. By controlling the media, they had control of adults. And at one point, one news reporter said, to be blunt, we're pretty much prostitutes. We write whatever we're told to write
Hmm.
in the media. And the academic institutions are set up that way in relation to the theme I mentioned earlier, the hatred of nature. When you go into a research program or a potential situation where you're going to be getting funding for experimentation, they say, what is your hypothesis? What do you think you're going to find? If you say, oh, I think I'm going to find that nature is fantastic and that we don't need to be spending millions of dollars in enriching corporations, we could solve these problems easily. Do you honestly think you're going to get funding in a situation like that? No. I mean, they know in advance what they want to hear you say. They want to hear you say that you're going to do something unnatural because that means that they can get a patent on it and then they can get super, super rich. A small group of people can get super, super rich. That's how a lot of academia looks at research. If you want that to stop, then we have to go with a different direction in our
Hmm.
educational system. As we were talking before, when it comes to practicality, this pod idea has been taking off a little bit. That might be the direction to go. I would like to keep interacting with other people in terms of building a curriculum that enough people could agree on. And if you have that, then maybe you can form pods, and then teachers like yourself could attract more students and they would get a higher quality education. The parents would save money, their kids would be empowered, and hopefully we can all live happily ever after.
I was just going to say that here comes the happily ever after ending. But that really is, I think, what it leads to. And it might sound a little utopian, but it is possible. It does take hard work, and it does take collaboration, and it does take cooperation. But I think that it's a very realistic way of looking at things in terms of placing responsibility on the individual. I'm a huge advocate, and with all my students, especially, for personal responsibility and for personal accountability, that's a very large hole in today's society. Is something, it's always someone else's fault, it's always somebody else's fault. Okay, that may be, but what parts of those systems are you responsible for? What parts of those systems are you accountable for? And what can you do to change them? Because there's always something that you can do, no matter how small. There's always something that you can do to start, because that's where big change happens. You have to start somewhere, and you have to start with small change. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, and you just reminded me of the motto for Alcoholics Anonymous.
Yes.
Not that I was ever an alcoholic. I'm not, but I grew up around alcoholics. And one of the motto, I think one of the primary mottos that they had was, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Yes.
So you'd like to think an educational system would teach along those lines.
I would like to think so. I think the template economy is much more realistic. Thank you so much for explaining everything to me. Thank you for taking the time for all of our listeners as well to listen. And thank you, Tim. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity, Kim. It was very enjoyable.
That was probably the longest and one of the most informative episodes of the Parent Solution to date. I sincerely hope that all of the listeners got something of value out of this episode. If you have any comments or questions, you can always find me on social media. It's Star Students on Facebook and LinkedIn, or starstudents.learning on Instagram. You can also reach out through email, which is all over social media channels. Thank you, as always, so much for listening, and I'll be back next week.